So the first thing we need to talk about is patience. So I'm just going to make a couple of assumptions based on the way that I felt when I first got started with investing. These were things that I felt myself, and my guess is if you're like me, you're feeling this way too. So first of all, you want your money to work for you. You don't want to be working for your money. That's why you're going to start investing. Second of all, you want to outpace inflation and earn a return on your investment. So you want to invest your money, you want to protect the buying power of your money by outpacing inflation. You also want to build long-term wealth. So you have goals, you have things you want to do in the future. Maybe eventually you want to retire. Maybe you want to own houses all over the country or all over the world. So everyone has that goal in mind, and most people need to build wealth in order to reach that goal. So my guess is that you have goals and you have the idea that you want to build long-term wealth. So I give you guys credit because most people are only focused on tomorrow, a very short term. Well, you really should focus on many years into the future. So by focusing on the future now, you really are going to set yourself up to have a much better life. However, I do know from my own experience that you might have the desire to open a trading account right now and dive in head first. Now, do I deter you from doing this? Not necessarily, because that is how I learned some of the best lessons when it came to investing, is by making my own mistakes. However, when it comes to investing and when you're making mistakes, those mistakes are costing you money. So if you can avoid making those mistakes by learning from some of my mistakes, that might be a better option for you. I mean, when I went through this, I was kind of going through it on my own. Yes, I was reading books and really educating myself with everything I could find, but there was nothing out there like this course that I'm creating. I really had to pave my own path, and we're just drowning in information out there. There's so much you can read and so many things you can get your hands on, and it's hard to tell what works and what doesn't work, or what is worth learning and what really isn't. So by following a path that someone has laid before you, you will have better success with this, and you're not going to have as much of that learning curve that I experienced. So the very first step you need to take is analyzing your current financial situation as well as your long-term investing goals, and that is pretty much everything we're going to cover during this module. So the first thing I want to talk about is this big amateur mistake, and this is the fact that many beginner investors are too focused on the balance sheet of companies they are studying and not their own balance sheet. The first balance sheet that you should study is your own balance sheet. So what I mean by that is analyzing your own expenses. So if you want to be a successful investor, that's going to require regular contributions to your trading account and regular investments. And if you aren't able to have a cash surplus at the end of each month, if you are living paycheck to paycheck, or you're currently in a situation where you're in debt, you need to fix your own financial situation before you think about investing in the future, because right now you don't even have any money to invest. So you want to make sure that you are operating as efficiently as possible and you are generating a positive cash surplus or a positive cash flow from your own life, because you need fuel for your investment account. You need to stoke that fire, because yes, you can make an initial investment, but the best investments are ones where you are regularly contributing over time. Now, investing requires patience, discipline, and the ability to get knocked around from time to time. So you do need to have thick skin. It's okay if you don't at first. It's okay if you're nervous and a little bit fearful, because this is something you're just going to develop over time as you become more comfortable with it. But one of the biggest mistakes investors make is tying up money they need in the short term. And this is a mistake I made myself. When I first got started, guys, I was really excited about investing, and I pretty much invested every dollar I had. I got to the point where I was leaving myself less than $1,000 in liquidity, which is the amount of money I had in my checking account. I was like 90% or more invested in the stock market because I was so excited and I was so eager to do this. However, once I came across a situation where I needed some short-term cash that I wasn't expecting, I really put myself in a tough situation because I didn't have the money, because I was too heavily invested in the stock market. So I really want to show you guys what level you should operate at as far as how much cash you should be holding on to no matter what, because you don't want to end up in that situation that I ended up in. So before you create your own personal balance sheet, it's important to understand what a balance sheet actually is, and really it's quite simple. A balance sheet is a list of all of your assets as well as your liabilities, as well as the market value of your assets used to determine your net worth. So it's essentially what do you owe and what do you own. So if you're calculating your net worth, you would take your assets or the market value of your assets subtracted by your liabilities, and that will give you an idea of what your current net worth is. So what I recommend to you is I would use a spreadsheet, or maybe you're not somebody who uses computers and Microsoft Excel or Google spreadsheets. Maybe just use a ledger and you're going to write it down in your ledger. But I want you guys to create your own personal balance sheet and update it every few months to track your progress, because ideally you want to see your net worth growing over time. If you're tracking your balance sheet and you're seeing that over time you're pretty much stagnating, where your net worth is the same, or even in a worst case scenario where over time your net worth is decreasing because you're realizing you're taking on too many liabilities, these are things you need to pay attention to. The main reason why people are not having success with money and why so many people are living paycheck to paycheck is because they are not monitoring their own expenses and doing things like this. So when you start to track your balance sheet, when you start determining your net worth and tracking it over time, you're really going to start to understand where your money is going and what you're doing with your money, and maybe some of the things that you shouldn't be doing with your money. As far as people in the United States and in America, we have this tendency to take on so many liabilities and take on so much debt, and really it is detrimental to your success as a long-term investor. And I really hope you guys start to think about that, because there's only so much you can do as far as educating yourself about investing. Yes, I'm going to show you how to, make sure you're not paying too much in expenses, how to actively manage your own money and not have to pay people to manage your money. But if you don't have a steady influx of cash going into your trading account, if you don't have a steady amount of money that you can invest, then what I'm teaching you will only go so far. You really need to make regular contributions to your account. And this is going to come from analyzing your own spending and figuring out where your money is going and where it shouldn't be going, and what you can do to save more money with the idea of investing it. So this is just an example of what a personal balance sheet might look like. So on the left-hand side we have assets, and on the right-hand side we have liabilities. So just a couple of examples of assets. We have retirement accounts. This could be your IRA, it could be your Roth IRA, it could also be a 401k, sponsored by your employer. It could be life insurance policies, it could be your trading accounts, your savings accounts, and then your checking accounts as well. And then this may also be things like collectibles. So maybe you have things that are worth money that you collect. This could be the vehicles that you own. Now, I do argue that I look at a vehicle as more of a liability because it has regular expenses and it depreciates in value. But if you are tracking this over time, you're going to be keeping track of the depreciation of your vehicle. That's because you're looking at the market value of your assets. So the market value of your vehicle is going to decrease over time. So if you are tracking your net worth and factoring in the depreciation of your vehicle, you will see that it is going to decrease over time because of the depreciation of the vehicles you own. This may also include recreational vehicles. Maybe you own a camper, maybe you own ATVs and things like that. Maybe you have a boat. Yes, these are considered assets, but they are a depreciating asset. Then we have your residence as well as any real estate you may own. And then your personal belongings. What is an estimated worth on the things that you own? And then in the right column there we have liabilities. So the biggest one for most people is your mortgage. And then you have other home equity loans. Many people have auto loans, student loans, and that's a place where people get in trouble too, is with auto loans. A lot of people end up upside down with their payments because the depreciation of the vehicle they bought outpaces the rate that they are paying it down. So you might end up in a situation where your vehicle is worth $15,000 and you owe $20,000 on it. So that means you're upside down on your payment and you owe more than that's even worth. That's a bad situation to be in. Another liability is your property taxes, your income taxes, as well as your regular insurance payments. So this is a very important step, guys, and I know it sounds like a lot of work, but I want you guys to do this because you need to do this in order to see what your net worth is and where it's going over time, because how are you going to track your progress otherwise? How are you going to know if you are successful or unsuccessful with your investing and with your money management? So what I want you guys to do is determine your total assets as well as your total liabilities and create a spreadsheet or do this in a ledger, and then subtract your liabilities from your assets to determine your net worth. And then I want you guys to do this 3 or 4 times a year. Maybe every quarter you sit down and you track your balance sheet and you determine your net worth. And I don't want you guys to rely on your memory to do this. I want you to go grab your calendar or set alarms on your phone for 3 months from now, or some kind of notification that tells you, hey, this Saturday I'm going to sit down for a couple hours and I'm going to go over my balance sheet again and track my net worth and see if it's growing or if it is contracting over time. This is just one of the most important steps, guys, to your financial success, is tracking your progress. Because, like I said, if you're not tracking your progress, how do you know whether you are doing a good job or doing a bad job at this? Or how do you know what's even going on with your personal finances if you're not tracking it? I mean, think about somebody who is trying to lose weight. If you're trying to lose weight and you're not weighing yourself and you're not portioning out your food, how would you know if you're losing weight? You could look in the mirror, but you're going to be changing so slightly, you're not really going to see those differences day by day. So think of this as losing weight. If you want to be successful at losing weight, you need to track your progress. As such, if you want to be successful with your life as far as your finances go, you need to track your progress, just like you would if you were trying to lose weight. Okay, so now we're going to talk about asset liquidity. And this is very similar to liquidity of the stock market, how easily you can convert your investments to cash. So, as we said earlier, stocks trading on major exchanges have high liquidity, so it would be very easy to sell those investments. Now, if you are trading stocks on a over-the-counter exchange, on an exchange with low liquidity, it would be more difficult to convert those stocks or those assets into cash. Now, just like stocks, every asset you own has a level of liquidity, and liquidity refers to how easily you can convert an asset into cash. So every financially responsible person needs a healthy amount of liquid assets, and in many cases this is just cash that's going to be sitting in your checking account. And the problem is, and this is a problem I ran into myself, is many people hold too many illiquid assets and they end up in a pinch when they have unexpected expenses. For me, this was car repairs. I was in a situation where I was driving an older car at the time, and I ended up needing to put about $2,000 worth of work into my car in about 2 weeks. And like I said, at the time, I was maintaining about $1,000 of liquid assets. I had $1,000 in my checking account, and every other penny was in my investing accounts because I was so eager to get started. And I ended up in a situation where I had to either put a car repair on my credit card that had a 24% interest rate, or I had to sell off some of my assets and liquidate them and then have money to make these car repairs. Now, luckily for me, I was in a situation where I was not down on my investments. They were actually up in value. So for me, the solution seemed simple enough. I was going to sell off some of my assets and use that money to make those car repairs. But if you were in a situation where you got caught up in a market correction, and let's say you were down 20% on that investment, you didn't have the plan to sell that because you know that it's likely a correction and it's cyclical and over time things will balance themselves out. But if you're in a situation where you need money and you don't have it, you may not have a choice and you may have to sell at a loss in order to cover those expenses. So that is the reason why you need a healthy amount of liquid assets sitting there in a bank account, sitting there in your checking account. On the other side of this, you don't want to be in a situation where you are holding too much money in liquidity either, because as you know, you earn a paltry rate of interest from a bank, and you don't want to be leaving your money sitting there in a checking account because at that point, it's being eaten away by inflation, as we talked about earlier in this course. So I want you to understand the liquidity of the assets you have, and I'm going to help you understand how much money you should have in liquidity at all times, and you don't really want to have more or less than this at any time. You want to have essentially that same amount, unless your expenses are growing over time, because the amount you have in liquidity is relative to your expenses. We're going to talk about this more in a second here. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the level of liquidity of the assets that people typically hold. And as you can see here with the columns, the higher up on the list, the more liquid these assets are. Cash or savings accounts have the highest level of liquidity because if you have cash, that is a liquid asset, and a checking account is essentially just your cash within an account. Now, if you have money in a savings account or a certificate of deposit, this is a highly liquid asset that can easily be converted into cash. So for your savings account, this may mean just withdrawing from that account or moving money over into your checking account. And as far as a CD or a certificate of deposit goes, this would mean just closing out that CD early. You may pay a small penalty for that, but still it is an easy thing to convert over to cash. Next up, we have stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. So if you are trading stocks and bonds on an index fund, and if you are trading exchange-traded funds, these are highly liquid assets. Now again, this is assuming that you are trading stocks that are being traded on a major exchange, because those are going to have good liquidity. But these are things that have high liquidity and they are easy to sell. Now if you do have a mutual fund set up through an individual institution and you are not trading exchange-traded funds, that is a little bit less liquid because it's going to take a little bit longer to convert that into cash. Because as you know, as far as exchange-traded funds go, or maybe you don't know this, we're going to talk about this later on in the course, but you sell those just like you would a stock, and you can have money from those within 3 days, 3 business days after your funds settle after selling them. Now, if you do sell them through your account that you have, so maybe you have a Vanguard mutual fund account, you would have to wait for them to mail you a check or direct deposit that money into your account, and that may be a slightly longer process. So next down on the list we have precious metals. Maybe this is gold or silver. This has mid liquidity because you would have to sell this to a buyer in person. So if you had to go out there and convert your precious metals into cash, this might be a lengthier process than selling a stock, but it still has a good level of liquidity. Then we have collectibles and antiques. These are a little bit lower on the list here because you need to sell these to a buyer in person, and you also need to have a buyer for these things. So if you have antiques and there is a small market of people who are looking to buy these things, it may be difficult to sell them. So the liquidity of antiques and collectibles is not as good as a precious metals or stocks, bonds, things like that. Then we have vehicles. This is even lower on that list because this has mid to low liquidity because, as you may know, if you've ever sold a car or a recreational vehicle or a boat, it takes time to sell something like this, and you also need to be in the right market for it. I mean, you wouldn't want to be somebody looking to sell a boat in the winter, so there is a time that you can sell things and a time when you really can't sell things. I mean, you wouldn't want to be the guy selling a snowmobile in the spring or a boat in the winter, or a sports car when it's snowing out. So it is difficult to sell vehicles. As such, they do have a lower liquidity. And then low liquidity would be real estate because it takes a lot of time to sell a house, especially if you're looking to get a fair market value for that piece of real estate. So what I want you guys to do is, on top of this balance sheet where you're listing out all of your assets, I want you to take everything you own and just determine what is the liquidity of the assets you own, and write down on this what would you sell first in a pinch. So let's say you ran out of liquid assets and you needed to sell things. What would you sell first? What would you have to sell? And then at this point, you're going to start to think about, do you have enough liquid assets? Do you have enough money sitting there in cash? Because odds are you either have too much money or you have not enough money. There's very few people out there that have the right amount of money sitting in liquid assets. You're either someone like me where in the past I had too little money in cash, or you're somebody who is afraid to invest, or you've just been saving in a checking account for so many years, and as such you have too much liquidity and you are having a lot of it being eaten up by inflation. So this is a very important step I want you guys to follow. You can pause this course and come back to it, or you can write this down and do it after you watch this, but you want to write down the level of liquidity of the assets that you have. So the big question that I'm assuming you guys have is this. So how much money should you have in liquidity? And what this comes down to is what you need in your emergency fund. So you should have enough liquid assets to cover 6 months of expenses. So as you can see, this answer is going to be different for everyone. If you're somebody who has very high monthly expenses, if your monthly expenses are $5,000 a month, you would want to have $30,000 in liquid assets to cover all of those expenses. If you're somebody with $1,000 of monthly expenses, you might want to have $6,000. So really it comes down to what you have in expenses each month, and you want to be able to cover all of your expenses for 6 months without having to liquidate any of your assets. So here's a question I want you to ask yourself right now. If you lost your source of income tomorrow, and unfortunately most of us have one source of income, how long would you be able to sustain yourself? How long would you be able to go before you were in a situation where you had to liquidate your assets or go into debt? I want you guys to answer this question now. So figure out what your monthly expenses are, and we're going to talk about how to do this in a little bit here. But once you understand what your monthly expenses are, take your liquid assets, divide it by your monthly expenses, and that's going to tell you how long you would be able to sustain yourself. And if that number is not equal to 6 months, you need to increase the size of your emergency fund and hold on to more liquid assets. So once you calculate your monthly expenses, multiply that number by 6 and keep that amount in savings or in a checking account. I don't want you guys to invest this money. I know you're excited, I know you're eager to do this, but you do not want to end up in a situation where you have to sell investments in order to pay for an expense. Do not use this money to buy investments. And the biggest thing I want you guys to do here is, if you do use this money, replace it and charge yourself interest to build up a larger cushion over time. So this might not be a bad idea, because think about it this way. If you need to pay for an expense and you put this on your credit card, and you're somebody who has a credit card in the neighborhood of a 15 to 25% interest rate, you're going to be paying a lot in interest. Why not use that same strategy but pay interest to yourself? So instead of paying interest to a financial institution, why not pay yourself interest? So if you're in a situation where you end up having to draw from your emergency fund, why not charge yourself a 25% rate of interest? That way you're putting back more money than you took out. That is the only real time I would add to the emergency fund, is if you are drawing from the fund or if your expenses change significantly. So if you end up in a house that is more expensive, and really that's not something I recommend doing, but if for whatever reason your expenses change, that is a time when you want to reevaluate how much money you need in that account. But if you do end up drawing from this account, rather than paying somebody else interest, pay yourself interest. Okay, so here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is somebody who is in a pinch, okay? So let's say you have $2,500 a month in total expenses, and you have $5,000 in liquid assets and $50,000 in illiquid assets. Now, I know this doesn't sound like a great situation, but understand that most people out there are in a paycheck-to-paycheck situation. So they are one paycheck away from going into debt. If you're somebody who is in this situation, I hope this sheds some light on why it's important to have an emergency fund. So let's say you lose your job and it takes you 6 months to get back on your feet. Your emergency fund sustains you for 2 months and you need another $10,000. So you sell your stocks despite the fact that you are down 10% due to a market correction. So this is a situation where you lost your job, you had one source of income, and your expenses exceeded what you had in your emergency fund. You were only able to sustain yourself for 2 months, and as a result you had to sell down. Even though you weren't planning on it because you knew this was a market correction, you had to sell your investments when you were down on those investments. And guys, this is not a situation you want to be in. And even worse, imagine if you were in a situation where you had $0 in liquid assets, because all of your money is tied up in investments, or you have no investments, you have no savings, and you lose your job and you're automatically going into debt. These are situations you do not want to be in, because debt can be a huge burden on you and it can take years to dig yourself out of debt. I know you're excited, I know you want to start investing, but the very first step to having success with investing is setting up enough money in an emergency fund to avoid ending up in this situation. Okay, so now I'm going to answer a very common question I would get on my channel, and it was really one that the answer seemed simple, but when you really sat down and thought about it, the answer wasn't so simple. The question is, what do you do if you are currently in debt and you want to invest? Should you pay off your debt first, or should you start investing and pay off your debt over time? And at first, my answer was simple. I would tell people, well, if you're in debt, pay off your debt first and be debt-free and then start investing. But then I really had to stop myself and think about it, because there's really a big difference between high-interest debt and low-interest debt. And I hope I'm able to explain this to you guys right now. So if you have credit cards, auto loans, personal loans that are charging you a high interest rate, you should pay off your debt first. So if you are paying a 15 or 20% rate of interest on a car payment, if you're paying 15 to 20% rate of interest on your credit cards or personal loans, then you 100% should pay off these loans first. Because historically speaking, as we said earlier, over the last 100 years, stocks have paid an annualized return of 8 to 10%. If you are paying interest rates in excess of this, you are better off paying down your high interest debt first. Let's say best case scenario, you're getting a 10% annualized return from the stock market, but you're paying 15% interest on a credit card. You would be better off paying down that credit card first rather than investing, because despite the fact that you had a 10% return on the money you invested, you still lost 15% on the interest you're paying on your debt. So your interest payments will exceed the returns from the stock market. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated when we talk about low interest debt. So if you have a mortgage, if you have student loans or any other low interest loans, you could invest while making at least a minimum payment on your loans. So it is not necessary to be debt free before investing in the stock market. So I want to give you a personal example of this. I, for a while, was driving a car that was older, and it was a car that I was not making a payment on. And over time, I found that I was eventually spending more money fixing that car than it was worth, and I was spending about as much per month as I would on a car payment. So I decided it would make more sense to buy a reliable form of transportation. So I did my research, I decided on a car that I wanted. I bought a car that was about a year and a half old, and then I sat down and I had a decision to make. I said, is it better to pay for this car in cash or to take out a loan on it and pay a small rate of interest? So I had enough money to pay for the car in cash, but I decided I was going to take out a loan on that car for the number one reason of establishing credit and building credit, and the second reason was because they offered me an interest rate of about 3%. Now, I have seen returns of well over 10% since I've started investing. So for me, the answer was simple. If I'm paying 3% interest on a $20,000 car loan, but I'm earning a much higher rate of return on $20,000 invested, it makes sense for me to leave that money in the market and to take out a loan, because even though I am paying interest, I'm making more money with that $20,000 than I would be saving by simply paying for that car in cash. So this is where the situation changes a little bit when we talk about low interest debt. So it's not necessary to be debt free before investing in the stock market. You don't need to pay off your mortgage and your student loans and your low interest debt. All I want you guys to do is make sure that your average annualized return exceeds what you are paying in interest on your low interest debt. And if you want to use the market average return, then figure you're going to get an annualized return somewhere around 8 to 10%. So if you have low interest debt in the 2 to 3% range, then I don't think you necessarily have to pay that off before you start investing. But if you do have debt in the 6, 7, 8% range, that's when you may want to consider paying off that debt before you start investing. And if it's over 8 to 10%, then you 100% need to pay off this debt before you start investing in the stock market, because there's no way you're going to see consistent returns that are outpacing what you are paying out in interest. Now, I know this seems simple, but unfortunately a lot of people out there don't even know how much debt they are in, who they owe money to, and what their interest rates are. So as part of setting up your balance sheet, if you're somebody who is in debt, I want you guys to set up a spreadsheet as well, or some kind of ledger where you write down who you owe money to, how much you owe, and what your interest rate is, so you can take a look at what is considered to be high interest debt and what is considered to be low interest debt, and then figure out, okay, if I want to start investing, I really need to start paying down this high interest debt first, because I'm never going to beat this return in the market, so it makes sense for me to pay this down first. So I want you guys to really get organized with your debt if you are in debt, and understand what you owe and what you're paying in interest as well. But now we're going to talk about assets versus liabilities, because I know earlier when we talked about a balance sheet, we said you want to write down a list of all of your assets as well as the market value of your assets, and then a list of all of your liabilities. But how do you do this if you don't know the difference between an asset and a liability? So if you do want to learn about this, guys, the number one thing I recommend is picking up the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. This is probably the most important book you will ever read on financial literacy and making good financial decisions, but I am going to summarize assets versus liabilities here in this section. So if you're looking to regularly contribute to your trading account, and you should be looking to do this, you need a positive cash flow. You need a regular influx of cash. And the first step to accomplish this is to understand the difference between assets and liabilities. Because the more liabilities you acquire, the less cash you will have left over at the end of each month to save or invest. This is like the one thing that people have yet to learn, and some people never learn this, and this is why people end up in a paycheck-to-paycheck situation. This is why you see people who are middle-aged with no money saved up, why you see people who are in debt even though they've been working for 30 years. Most people are chasing the illusion of wealth, and as a result they acquire liabilities. And this is a financial trap, guys. You don't want to be in this situation. You don't want to be somebody who does this. So first of all, let's talk about what an asset is. So an asset is an economic resource, and it is something that appreciates in value or produces value. So as an investor, you want to own more assets, and if you're looking to increase your net worth, you want to increase the number as well as the quality of the assets that you own. So just a few examples of assets are stocks, bonds, because these are things that are going to be producing value or appreciating in value. So a stock will likely appreciate in value and bonds are going to produce value. Real estate will do both of these things because a real estate investment appreciates in value and it can also produce rental income. Copyrights, patents, collectibles, artwork, classic cars. Notice I didn't say sports cars or brand new vehicles, because while some call these assets, I really would call this a liability because there's something that is costing you money. But many classic cars are going to at least maintain their value or appreciate in value, and these are just a few examples of assets. So now we have liabilities. So a liability is a debt that you are responsible for or a financial obligation, and liabilities are also things that depreciate in value. So a few examples of liabilities are vehicles, so brand new vehicles, recreational vehicles, boats, things like that, any form of debt, rent payments, monthly bills, taxes, and more. Now, a mortgage is different because with a mortgage you're building equity, but with rent payments you're essentially throwing that money out the window because you're not building any equity. And unfortunately, the number one thing that many people look for, especially young people, when they're looking to build long-term wealth and get rich, is they want to drive the sports cars and the fancy cars and the expensive cars. But the truth is that is one of the biggest liabilities that you could ever own, is an expensive car, because not only are you paying a very high rate to insure this car, it's going to depreciate in value, and it's a huge liability. And in order to get to a point where you are able to afford that car, you need to acquire assets. So that's why many people start off the journey of becoming rich and really becoming financially well off and financially stable by having the idea of eventually owning that Lamborghini or owning that sports car. But somewhere along the way, when they're educating themselves, they understand that that's a huge liability, and they realize they really don't want that for themselves. And that's really when you start to transcend and really become somebody who is just, you understand things, you just get it. But if this is what motivates people from the beginning, is thinking about driving that Lamborghini or that expensive car or owning that yacht, I understand that. You need something to motivate you and you need something to focus on. But I'm hoping that eventually you're going to see that this is all about the illusion of wealth, and the expensive cars are one of the biggest liabilities that you can own. This is not an asset. Alright, so let's say you followed all of these steps. You went ahead and you created your balance sheet and you looked at your assets and your liabilities. You looked at your debt and you didn't like what you saw. You found that you have more liabilities than you do assets, and you actually have a net worth that is in the negative dollar amount. Or you find that you have a lot of high interest debt and you're realizing you're in no position to start investing right now. What do you do? Well, one of the things you really need to do if you're in that situation and if you are serious about investing is you need to downsize. And if you are focused on the illusion of wealth and acquiring liabilities, you are at a serious disadvantage in life. You are in the rat race. You are going to be spending every dollar you earn, and you're going to be working a lot longer than the people who decide that they don't want to pretend to be rich. They want to actually be rich. They want to actually be wealthy over time. So the truth is that most people that appear wealthy are actually burdened with debt. And I want you guys to start thinking about stealth wealth. So this is rather than showing off your wealth with jewelry and expensive cars. Don't show it off, because why are you looking to impress people in the first place? Just know yourself that you are building wealth for yourself and you really are going to be rich, and you're not going to have to worry about faking it because you're actually going to be somebody who is wealthy, because you're being smart with your money. You're not trying to appear wealthy and you're not buying liabilities. The number one thing you really need to do is, if you're in a situation where you are chasing the illusion of wealth, is stop doing this right now. So stop spending money on things that make you appear wealthy, and maybe you have things you can sell, maybe you can downsize, and at the very least, maybe you're not trying to sell things to make money, you're just trying to sell things to lower your liabilities and hopefully increase your positive cash flow. So that's the number one thing I'd recommend, is if you're in a situation where you've done these first steps and you don't like what you saw, it's probably time to downsize. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about income and expenses. So your income and expenses determine your cash flow, and this is something you really need to calculate in order to see if you have a positive cash flow, if you have a negative cash flow, and where your money is going. So the goal is to have a positive cash flow that allows you to build up your emergency fund, pay off high interest debt, and eventually invest in assets like stocks. Now, maybe you're in a situation where you don't have any high interest debt. That's a great situation to be in. All you really need to do is build up enough to cover 6 months of your expenses, and maybe then you're going to be ready to invest in assets like stocks. So you can increase your positive cash flow in two ways. Number one is lowering your expenses. This is the defensive approach. And number two is to increase your income, and this is the offensive approach. Now, the best strategy is to do both of these things. So here we have the CEO versus the employee, and as I'm sure you can imagine, the CEO likely lives in a much larger house than the employee. He probably drives a luxury vehicle. However, let's take a look at their cash flow here. So let's say the employee has $2,500 of monthly income and $2,000 of monthly expenses. That would give them a $500 positive cash flow. Now, the CEO makes a lot more money than the employee, so let's say the CEO has $15,000 of monthly income and $14,500 of monthly expenses. So despite the fact that the employee and the CEO make a significantly different amount of money, they both have the same positive cash flow at the end of the day because the CEO has much higher monthly expenses. Now, this is what people do. As they make more money, they spend more money, and they never get anywhere in life. They're just treading water at that point. It doesn't matter if you make $1,000 a month or $100,000 a month. All that matters is what your positive cash flow is and what you're keeping at the end of each month. And this is something people do not understand. Most people continue to upgrade their standard of living as they earn more money. It makes sense, and really this is something I did myself before I really opened my eyes to what I was actually doing to myself. So when I was employed, when I worked a job before I was an entrepreneur, I was in a situation where I went from earning a lesser amount of money and I got a couple dollar an hour raise. And I said, wow, okay, so I have an extra couple $100 a week coming in. What can I buy? What can I do with my money? And that is when I decided to buy my expensive car. And I bought a Subaru WRX. And that is when I learned one of the most valuable lessons of my life. When I drove that car for a year, and after about 2 weeks, the excitement wore off, and then it was just a method of transportation. And at the end of 1 year of driving that car, I ended up spending over $10,000 that I would never see back because the vehicle depreciated, and I didn't get as much as I paid for it, and I was paying interest on car payments. And I remember sitting down and feeling like shit because I was like, wow, I just burned through $10,000. I spent more than I even made getting that raise after taxes, and it was really a terrible decision. But luckily I was able to learn that lesson young, and so few people actually learn this lesson, and it really blows my mind. And maybe it's because they're not being exposed to this, and I'm hoping that maybe you guys aren't going to make these mistakes. That's really why I do what I do on YouTube. That's why I do things like this, because I don't want you guys to end up being like the majority of people out there. I want you to be successful and actually be successful. I don't want you to be chasing the illusion of wealth. But this is a mistake I made myself, and I'm very comfortable with sharing these things with you guys because I want to be as honest as possible with you guys and tell you about the mistakes I've made as well as the things that I've done right. And you never get anywhere doing this. So this is why the employee and the CEO have the same positive cash flow in the previous example. So in that example, both of those people can set themselves up for the same financial outcome. However, that CEO has much higher monthly expenses, so he's going to need a much larger retirement or a much larger amount of money. So the employee likely drives an affordable vehicle and the CEO likely drives a brand new luxury vehicle. I want you to imagine for a second if the CEO had the same monthly expenses as the employee. So imagine if that employee worked their way up and became the CEO of that company, and never once did they increase their expenses. They stayed in the same house, they drove the same vehicle, or eventually when they bought a new vehicle, they didn't buy a luxury car. They stuck to an affordable vehicle, they never raised their expenses. Imagine that. Imagine having a positive cash flow of $13,000. Imagine what you could do with that. There is so much you could do if you just don't increase your expenses as you earn more money. This is like the number one mistake people make. I know I say that about a lot of things. People make a lot of mistakes, but this is a big one, is increasing your expenses as you earn more money, feeling you deserve more, you deserve better. And all you're doing is prolonging the amount of time you're going to be working and delaying your financial goals and the financial outcome you're looking for. Okay, so now let's talk about expenses. So when it comes to expenses, they can be broken down into fixed expenses and discretionary expenses. So fixed expenses are the necessary expenses that are keeping you alive. These are things you need. This is like your electricity. This is like your heat. This is like your mortgage for the house that you live in. And then you have discretionary expenses, and these are the expenses that you have the most control over, as they are optional expenses. Now, both fixed and discretionary expenses can be lowered. So even though you do have fixed expenses that are keeping you alive, you can lower these expenses. Let's go over a couple of examples of fixed expenses. This could be your mortgage payment. This could be your utilities, your insurance, your loans, your household necessities, your groceries, your vehicle expenses. But again, these can be lowered. So maybe you're going to ask yourself a couple of questions like this. What is the size of the house you live in? Because while a house is a shelter and a house is a place to live and a place to be, the size of the house really determines how much you're going to be spending on a mortgage. So what is the size of the house you live in? Let's talk about groceries, the things that you consume to stay alive. Are you buying things on sale? Are you buying off-brand products? Because if you want to be defensive, you can start buying things on sale and buying products that are off-brand to save some money. Again, this is the defensive approach, and this only goes so far, but it can help you find some extra money and increase your positive cash flow. And then let's talk about that vehicle that you are driving. Is it bad on gas? Is it more than you need? So maybe you're driving something like this Hummer here. You have enough room for 7 passengers, and 95% of the time you're the only one in that car. You have more than you need, and you're spending more on gas than you should be. So this is a way that you can really lower your fixed expenses by asking yourself some of these questions and maybe downsizing if you have to. So now we have discretionary expenses. So this is things like alcohol consumption, dining, vacation, anything luxury, any convenience items, entertainment, and unplanned purchases. This is where you guys are going to go hard and really find expenses that you don't need. If you guys want to get a positive cash flow, you need to absolutely destroy your discretionary expenses. You need to go in there and you need to be ruthless. You need to analyze your expenses. You need to sit down and track all of your expenses over the last couple of months. And many years ago, guys, this might have been something that is difficult to do. You would have had to track all of your receipts or write everything down in a checkbook. But now there are no excuses, because all those of us that are using bank accounts online, we have access to online statements. We have access to months of statements. The only reason you're not doing this is because you are lazy. The only reason you're not doing this is because you don't want to do it. If you want to do this, if you really want to get a hold of your discretionary expenses and see where your money is going, all the evidence is there in your online statements, and oftentimes you have 6 months or more of record you could go back and look at. So I want you guys to ask yourselves questions like this. How often are you eating out of the house? What is the price of convenience? So when you do decide to drive through fast food rather than making meals at home, what is that really costing you every day? Do you plan out your purchases? So when you do need to buy things, are you just going out and buying them, or are you planning for them? And what is your entertainment budget? And do you even have an entertainment budget? Or do you just spend whatever amount of money you want on entertainment? So this is really where you guys are going to find most of the money, is in these discretionary expenses. So I highly encourage you guys to go back and start to look at your expenses and see how much money you're spending on discretionary expenses. So as we said earlier, the two ways to increase your positive cash flow would be to lower your expenses or increase your income. So hopefully by now you have a good idea of how to lower your expenses, both your discretionary and non-discretionary expenses. You have an idea of the trap that people end up in, where they increase their expenses as they earn more money. And now I want to talk about income. So equally important to your expenses is what you are taking in each month. So while it is more difficult to earn more than it is to spend less, it can significantly improve your financial outlook. So this is more of the offensive approach to having a positive cash flow. So I want you guys to consider making an investment in yourself before investing in assets like stocks. So if you're in a situation where you're making minimum wage, or you're making a low rate of income, and you could learn a more valuable skill, maybe start a side hustle, or work more hours at your job to increase your income, this is going to help you so much in the long run. Rather than, go with the defensive approach and try to shrink your expenses as much as possible and try to, pinch a dime out of a dollar, why not try to earn more money while doing that as well, and eventually having a lot more money to invest? So while it is important to invest in things outside of yourself, the first thing you really need to do is invest within yourself, especially if you can learn a more valuable skill and eventually earn more money, because if you can earn more money, you're going to be able to invest more money. So this is just something I want to plant in your head. And obviously, this is not going to be a course about how to make more money. I mean, maybe down the road I could do something like this, but this is just something I want you guys to think about. Before you invest outside of yourself, before you invest in assets, think about if that money would be better suited investing in yourself and investing in a way that you could learn a more valuable skill and earn more money. And at that point, you are definitely going to increase your positive cash flow. So we've really covered a lot in this section so far. I would argue that this is going to be one of the most important things I cover in this course. So I just want to do a recap of everything we've talked about so far, so you guys have a checklist of things you need to do. So number one, the first thing you want to do is create a personal balance sheet to understand what your assets are, what your liabilities are, and what your net worth is. And like we said, you're going to track your net worth over time. Maybe you're going to do this 3 or 4 times a year. Number two, you're going to organize your assets in terms of liquidity. So you want to understand what you would sell first if you needed to, and understand what things you could sell easily and what things would be more difficult to sell. We also talked about setting up your emergency fund at that point and determining how much your monthly expenses are and what you need to have set aside in that emergency fund. Next, we talked about your high interest debt. So if you're somebody who has high interest debt, you need to pay off your high interest debt first. Number 4, we talked about what assets you own and what liabilities are holding you back. So I want you guys to create a list of your assets and your liabilities and determine what things you may be able to get rid of and how you might be able to downsize. That was number 5, consider downsizing to increase your positive cash flow. The 6th thing we talked about is determining what your fixed and discretionary expenses are. So I want you guys to sit down and make a list of these things. I want you guys to go through your bank statements and take a look at what your discretionary expenses are and really set a budget for these things. Set a budget for your entertainment expenses. The 7th thing, which we kind of addressed already, was lowering your expenses and setting a goal for that emergency fund. Really, the first thing you're going to do before you start contributing to a trading account is pay off that high interest debt and build up a 6-month cash cushion. And then the 8th thing we just talked about there was considering ways to maybe invest in yourself before you're investing in assets outside of yourself. So consider ways that you could earn more money yourself. So the goal of this is to increase your income while lowering your expenses. You are on the offensive and the defensive approach by doing this. So let's say you're in the first situation where you have $2,000 of income, and then over time you're able to make a little bit more income. Maybe you invest in yourself, you learn a more valuable skill, or maybe you're just picking up more hours at work and you get to a point where you're making $2,200 a month and then $2,500 a month in income. At the same time though, you're getting serious about your expenses and you're slashing your expenses. You found some ways to lower your discretionary and your non-discretionary expenses, and your expenses went from $1,700 a month down to $1,400 and eventually down to $1,100 a month. So while your income is increasing, your expenses are lowering. This is the goal here. This is what you guys want to do. So what is this actually going to look like? Well, at first, in that first example there, you had a $300 positive cash flow. But then you figured out a way to maybe work a little harder and earn some more money while lowering your expenses. Next thing you know, you have an $800 positive cash flow. And then you got really good at tracking your expenses. You found out you had a lot of discretionary expenses. You started buying things on sale and really planning out your purchases. And you also figured out that if you start taking courses online, you're going to be able to get a promotion at work. Let's say you get that promotion and you've lowered your expenses. Now you're in a situation where you have a $1,400 positive cash flow compared to that $300 positive cash flow you had earlier on. So this is why this is so important, guys, because imagine what you could do with $1,400 a month invested in the stock market compared to $300 a month. So I know the first step seems like to start investing, but this is not the first step, guys. The first step is to take stock of your own financial situation and really get things to be efficient and really figure out how to increase your positive cash flow to invest more money in your future. So now I want to talk about an investing strategy, and this is something that I learned from Money Master the Game by Tony Robbins. If you guys are looking for good books to read, I highly recommend Unshakable by Tony Robbins as well as Money Master the Game, but I love this strategy he talked about, which is putting a tax on yourself. So one of the best ways you can save money in order to invest is to tax yourself. So the truth is, everyone complains about taxes, but we all pay them despite this. So no matter what, even though it hurts, even though it might make us cry, we're going to pay those taxes. So rather than paying taxes to somebody else, why not tax yourself as well? So what if you were to impose a tax on yourself of no less than 10% of your income after taxes? And if you acted like this is a tax that you are paying to the government, you're going to pay this no matter what. Yes, some months it's going to hurt, sometimes it's going to make you cry, but you're going to pay it. And the problem is that most people pay everyone else before they pay themselves. And imagine if you paid yourself through a self-imposed tax. Imagine what this could mean for you. So I want to give you guys a big picture example of this, and I'm hoping this is going to really get you excited about what you can actually do by following these strategies. And so many people out there are pushing unrealistic returns on people and telling you that you need to see a 20%, 30% return on your investments in order to get rich, and you do not need to see those kind of returns. Those are unrealistic returns you're going to get from high-risk strategies, and I just don't recommend this. So I want to give you guys a big picture example of somebody who followed this self-imposed tax strategy. So let's say John has a monthly income of $3,000 after taxes, and John spends all that he earns paying others first. So John decided to follow this strategy. He went through my course and he said, okay, you know what? I'm going to lower my monthly expenses, my discretionary and my non-discretionary expenses, and I'm going to be ambitious and impose a 15% tax on myself, which is going to go directly into my trading account. He automates this, guys. You need to automate it, otherwise you're not going to do it. So every month, on the first of the month, the day he gets paid, he has 15% of everything he will earn that month go into his trading account. It is a self-imposed tax. So John complains about this. Sometimes it hurts, sometimes he is strapped for cash, but he pays it regardless. And it is important to remember too that John does have an emergency fund built up as well, so he's not by any means, having too much tied up in illiquid assets. But regardless of this, regardless of the complaining, he does this every single month. And what he does with this money is he invests in an index fund of blue chip stocks that earns a historical rate of 8%. So what is this actually going to look like for John? How is this going to pan out? So in order to do this, we are going to look at a compound interest calculator. So if you take 15% of $3,000, that comes out to $450 a month. That is the self-imposed tax that John is putting on himself. And let's say he plans on working another 25 years. Now, without increasing this, with keeping this at 15% of $3,000, and eventually he's going to earn more money, so I'm sure he would be investing more money as he went forward. So if he kept that at 15% and he was earning more money over time and getting raises, he would be increasing how much he is investing each month. But even if he didn't, even if he kept this at $450 a month, over 25 years, earning an 8% average rate of return, I want to show you what this could mean for John. So in 25 years, John would have a portfolio worth just under $400,000. Just under $400,000 from the self-imposed tax. Guys, this is how much you can really make by having a long-term vision and by doing things with a realistic approach and really understanding what the power of compound interest is. And we have a whole module where we're going to talk about compound interest, but I just want to expose this to you guys now of what you really can do with your money and how powerful this self-imposed tax can really be. So this is what I'm talking about, guys. This is the big picture here, and this is why it is so important to follow these steps early on. Okay, so the last thing we're going to cover in this module, I know this one's been kind of a marathon, and I have a lot of things I want you guys to do, so you definitely have some homework with this one, but the last thing we're going to cover is your investing goals, because everything you do in life requires goals. I mean, if you're out there trying to lose weight or you're trying to accomplish something, you're going to set goals for yourself, or you should be anyway. Because if you don't set goals, you have no way of holding yourself accountable. So just with anything else in life, you need investing goals. And your long-term investing goals should be both measurable and attainable. They don't want to be out of reach, because if your goals are out of reach, you're going to feel the need to make high-risk investments. So your goal should allow you to enjoy your life as well. You don't want to be in a situation where all you're thinking about is investing, you're saving all of your money, and you never go on vacation, and you never have any fun with your life. You want a balance of both of these things. So having realistic goals and looking for a realistic return from the market keeps investors on track and subdues the urge to seek higher risk investments for a higher possible return. So your investing plan should include specific contribution rates and realistic expectations based on market history. The only time people seek higher risk investments is when they really haven't set up a good plan, because they're realizing, oh, my goals are out of reach. I need to do something higher risk, and you don't want to be in that situation. If this is done right, you can sit back and laugh at all the people that are chasing those high risk investments, understanding that you're following a very low risk and realistic investing strategy that's going to build you massive amounts of wealth over time. It's only those that really aren't doing it right that are chasing these high-risk investment vehicles. So what happens when you don't have a plan? I want you guys to think about this. What would happen if you went to build a house without a blueprint? If you went to the store and you said, I'm going to buy a bunch of lumber, I'm going to buy a bunch of construction material, and I'm just going to go build a house. I have no plan. So how many people do you know that have built a house without a blueprint? Because I don't know a single person. It seems like a good way to make a lot of mistakes. Unfortunately, I know a lot of people that have started investing without a plan. Investing without a plan is a mistake many people make that often yields discouraging results. Now, could this be the reason that many call the stock market a losing game? I think this is the reason. I think that many people who start investing do this without a plan. They have no plan in place, they have no idea what they're looking to do, and as a result, they have no goal in mind. So they start doing high-risk things with their investments, and as a result, they do lose money, and then they're going to stop, and they're going to get out of the market, they're going to be frustrated, they're going to be angry at themselves, and then they're going to tell other people, don't bother with the stock market, it's a losing game, I lost a lot of money. So I want to ask you guys a question. If you build a house without a blueprint, and it falls over, do you blame the construction material supplier? So do you blame the person who made those 2x4s? No. You would blame the person who built the house. You would blame the person who decided to build a house without a blueprint. But for some reason, people don't follow the same logic with the stock market. When people start investing in the stock market without a plan, they blame the market. They don't blame the fact that they don't have a plan. So the key to success at anything in life is a well-defined plan and realistic goals that will keep you on track. So that is why you guys need to have a plan when it comes to investing. It's the same thing as having a blueprint when you go to build a house. So I highly encourage you guys to write down your investing plan, and I want to give you guys a few factors that you should include in your investing plan. Number one is your objective. This is essentially how much you want to save and what you are saving for. Number two is your control. So this is how much time you have, what your current net worth is, which you're going to determine looking at your balance sheet, as well as your monthly income and your expenses, which is going to tell you what your positive cash flow is. Number three is risk, and this is your tolerance for risk and volatility. Number four is going to be your level of contribution, or what you are willing to contribute each month, and if you are going to be rising your contribution each month over time as you earn more money. Number five is your assets, so this is what you will be investing in. And number six is your rebalancing and evaluation strategy, which is going to be the frequency of rebalancing your portfolio and evaluation of whether or not you are on target to meet your objective, which you clearly defined in step one of this plan. So let's go over an example of what this plan might look like, and I highly encourage you guys to start filling out this plan yourself. Maybe you aren't ready to fill out the assets section yet because we haven't gotten there yet, but you should be able to start with this. Maybe figure out what your objective is, your control, what your tolerance for risk is, and what you're willing to contribute. So here's an example of a plan. Let's say somebody has the objective of saving $1,500,000 by the age of retirement. The control is they have 45 years of time. They currently have a net worth of $20,000 with $3,000 monthly income and $2,200 a month of monthly expenses, which gives them an $800 positive cash flow. As far as risk goes, they have a mild tolerance for volatility and loss, and their contribution level is going to be $600 a month. They're going to impose a 20% tax on themselves. As far as their asset diversification goes, they're going to put 65% in stock funds and 35% in bond funds, and their rebalancing and evaluation strategy is going to be to rebalance and evaluate progress annually. So this is what an investing plan looks like. You need to have one of these before you start investing. Otherwise, you're essentially building a house without a blueprint. You need to solidify what your plan is and what your goals are. It's like trying to lose weight without weighing yourself. If you're just trying to lose weight and you're looking in the mirror, you're going to have no idea if you're losing weight. You need to constantly be jumping on the scale and tracking your progress.